Well, thank you and welcome to this evening's forum event focusing on environmental policy in the context of the 1992 election. This event is jointly sponsored by the Energy and Environmental Policy Student Interest Group and the Environment and Natural Resources Program of the Center for Science and International Affairs here at the Kennedy School, and we welcome you all to this event. These forum events are designed to try to bring some of the most important policy issues and policy players before the audiences here at Harvard and elsewhere. And tonight we are very fortunate to have representatives of the political campaigns. I will inform you that we asked each of the three major presidential campaigns to suggest an appropriate speaker this evening, and the Perot campaign declined. But we have representatives of the Bush campaign and the Clinton campaign, and we are indeed fortunate to have them here. Tonight, each of our two speakers will provide a brief opening set of remarks, and then we have, somewhat in the style of the presidential debates, a panel of students from here at the Kennedy School who will address questions to our two speakers. And following that, we'll have an opportunity for each of you in the audience, if you'd like to address a question to the speakers, and you will see that there are microphones set up for you to do so. Well, environmental issues, of course, when we poll the American public, turn out to be very important in the public's mind. And as many of you know, many Americans, the vast majority of Americans, report themselves to be environmentalists and to be concerned about environmental issues. And yet, we were talking earlier that the environmental issues have somewhat receded from this political campaign as it has gone on. And we hope that this forum will provide an opportunity to bring some of those issues front and center again. Representing, and I'll introduce both speakers, but let me first introduce Governor Bruce Babbitt. Bruce Babbitt, as many of you know, was governor of Arizona from 1978 through 1987, and of course a presidential candidate in 1988. Governor Babbitt is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, the University of Newcastle, and the Harvard Law School. He's currently in private law practice with Steptoe & Johnson in Phoenix and in Washington. Governor Babbitt's interest in environmental affairs, of course, is long and deep, reflecting his commitment to his state and to the national agenda on environmental policy. He currently serves as the national president of the League of Conservation Voters. He's a member of he has been a member of the Presidential Commission to investigate the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. He has served with the Grand Canyon Trust and numerous other environmental organizations. And Governor Babbitt comes here tonight as a representative of the Clinton campaign. Let me also introduce at this time, so that my introduction will not break their flow, let me introduce Henry Hank Havoc, who is Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Havoc has been serving as the Deputy Administrator of EPA since 1989. Prior to that, he was in private law practice and also served from 1981 through 1987 with the Department of Justice, and for 4 years headed the Department of Justice Land and Natural Resources Division. He formed and chaired the National Environmental Enforcement Council. He served on the Board of Directors of the Executive Committee of the Environmental Law Institute, and he's chaired the American Bar Association's Toxic and Environmental Tort Committee. Obviously, we have two representatives of the environmental issues of the day, and in this case, the environmental issues that the presidential candidates have to some extent addressed, but we hope will be addressed through both Governor Babbitt and Mr. Havoc tonight. So, Governor Babbitt, why don't you take...
Is there a clock? 5, 10 minutes? 5, 10 minutes? Good. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. I think I have enough voice to make it through tonight, but just barely, and I confess that that's because of an excess of campaigning with great enthusiasm for the Clinton-Gore ticket. Rodrigo. What I'd like to do is use my 10 minutes to just kind of lay out some themes as I see it. Now, my premise, I suppose, is no surprise. The Bush administration has been an unmitigated environmental disaster on nearly every front. There is a conspicuous exception, and that is the Environmental Protection Agency, whose representative is here tonight. Bill Riley has been a principled and thoughtful advocate of the environment. We have not always agreed with him. We have always respected his integrity and the integrity of the department. The best example of that integrity is the fact that Mr. Riley has been in near continual conflict with a president who manifestly is irritated that he made the mistake of appointing one environmentalist in his administration. Now, I must tell you that apart from that one glimmer of light, there is a desolate plain of appointments. The Interior Department in the hands of Manuel Lujan. Manny Lujan's idea of an endangered species is one of his relatives who doesn't have a federal job. The Department of Energy has spent all of its efforts building bombs and has yet to formulate any energy policy other than more nuclear of all kinds in all places. They modestly believe we should, by the turn of the century, double the nuclear power base of this nation. The Department of Commerce has abandoned any pretense of exercising its responsibility to conserve ocean resources, and it goes on to the horizon. Now, I think there are 3 or 4 areas that I'll traverse briefly, illustrating what I think the failures are, and then suggesting, by contrast and by implication, where it is we should go. We should start with energy. It's been a subject of much interest and study and concern at this school and elsewhere. And we simply have an energy bill, but we don't have an energy policy. And the reason is that this country is presided over by a Texas oil man who honestly, to the depth of his being, believes that there is no problem that can't be solved by throwing open more wildlife preserves, more offshore areas, to more drilling with more tax subsidies and more government support. This government is presided over by an oil man. Now, he has attempted, of course, to make his support of these policies an issue. It hasn't worked. He has, in effect, said it's a question of environment or jobs. You can't have both. His most demagogic statement of that principle are his trips to Detroit. Behind in Michigan, he repeatedly goes back to Detroit, calls the auto workers together and says, if we improve the efficiency of automobiles, we're going to destroy 300,000 jobs. And one may be pardoned if you're asking, well, haven't we had some success with auto efficiency? That has gone from 14 to 26. And isn't it true that those auto efficiency standards apply to British cars, French cars, German cars, Japanese cars? So how do we lose jobs? A demagogic attempt to say, in a mean-spirited and negative way, the American dream isn't large enough to accommodate both the environment and jobs. And small wonder that Clinton and Gore have contented themselves with saying, the American dream is large enough to accommodate both. And we will and we can. The challenge in national energy policy is simply to get back on the track of saying, we've got to get off this fossil fuel-based economy. We do that with a nice, thoughtful array of technology forcing standards, conservation incentives, economic incentives, both in terms of eliminating subsidies for fossil and nuclear fuels and gradually moving up economic incentives for other kinds of energy, and perhaps eventually, I believe, moving toward a restructuring of the tax system to end the inherent subsidies in the current tax system. We can talk about that. A word about biodiversity. Biodiversity is a term that to me encompasses a lot of different areas: wetlands, endangered species, the management of our forest reserves, the management of our lands. The President started off, I was in Iowa in 1988, the day he gave a speech to Ducks Unlimited and said there will be no net loss of wetlands. No net loss of wetlands. The response since then has been an Orwellian device. We won't have any loss of wetlands. We've just redefined them to reduce the number of wetlands by nearly 50%. They're parts of the Everglades which no longer qualify as wetlands. With respect to endangered species, a piece of legislation which has been an enormous success. It's another approach to biodiversity which says we need to try to manage the land and live a little more lightly on the land and leave a little more space. The spotted owl has been the scene of another sustained demagogic attempt to divide American people. In most parts of the country, endangered species issues have been resolved by conciliation and discussion. They haven't here because this administration didn't want to. This administration set out the Secretary of the Interior, convened the God Squad to override the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, didn't even bother to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act on the way. They didn't want to comply with it. They wanted a fight. They wanted to pour gasoline on the flames. Well, the answer in the next administration is to say, we understand the importance of endangered species, which is really about habitat, which is really about space and the way we live on the land. It'll be up to the President and the Vice President to lead on those issues. I'd like to close with two other things that relate to the international implications of our policies. One is the oceans. This administration in the Department of Commerce has set out repeatedly at every step to frustrate the attempts of Congress to say that we are going to regulate and ask other nations to regulate the destruction of dolphins in tuna fishing, the use of drift net, the regulation of marine mammal species. The Department of Commerce under President Bush has been in the courts nonstop refusing to abide by those laws. The President, over the obvious objections to Bill Riley, went to Rio for the purpose of sabotaging the Earth Summit. And they succeeded. They got a cosmetic agreement to reduce carbon dioxide by setting goals when the rest of the world was ready to go way beyond goal setting. They refused to sign a biodiversity treaty that every other nation with biotechnology willingly signed, the Europeans, the Japanese, and others. The United States of America did not sign and didn't make a serious effort to negotiate a treaty with all of the other signatories it could have signed, because the President, catering to the extreme right in this country, was hell-bent on saying the problem in this country is the environment. If I can persuade people that the problem is environmental regulation, I can distract them from the economic failures and in turn blame the economic failures on the environment. I have a feeling I have gotten carried away, eaten up my time, and if you want to follow any of these subjects up, I'd be delighted to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for I think the left-handed compliment about EPA, Governor Babbitt. I don't know where to start, so I think what I'll do is to start with a number of facts and observations about what's happened over the last 3.5 years, because the important issue in this election really is looking at what we've set out to do, what we've done, what specifically we hope to do in terms of integrating the environment into every aspiration that society has, and determining whether you have enough specifics from the Clinton campaign, other than some of the things we've heard here tonight, which aren't very specific, to make a judgment about exactly what Governor Clinton would do. For example, one question I'd like to hear from Governor Babbitt on is, does the Clinton campaign support a commitment, which I think was the League of Conservation Voters' position, a commitment to reduce CO2 by 20% by the year 2000, and the rationale for that. But there are a number of issues. What I would like to do is share a few thoughts. I do want to thank the Kennedy School for putting this together. I do think institutions like the Kennedy School here and other institutions around the country which are working to integrate environmental policy, the disciplines that form environmental policy, economics, the natural sciences, law, and public policy are extremely important as society comes to grips with the kinds of issues that we have to deal with. And I do admire Governor Babbitt. Certainly if I were the president, I'd much rather be running against Governor Clinton than Governor Babbitt. And I'm anxious to learn his candidate's positions. Well, let me just talk briefly about President Bush's agenda, where we've been, where we're going on the environment, and to enlist all of your support, whatever happens. But I do think a Bush administration is the right approach. I want you to know how much President Bush has personally focused, despite the rhetoric, on environmental progress, despite the rhetoric about an unmitigated disaster in environmental policy. Mention some of his accomplishments to be sure we build on a base of facts. But I want to start with goals, the goals that he articulated in the campaign, the goals that he reaffirmed as early as 1989 in Spokane, Washington. The recognition that the environment is now permanently established as a core value in our society. Second, that the President wants to have the federal government work with society to build an inextricable linkage between the economy and the environment, and to have every institution in society internalize environmental considerations into every decision that we all make in government and the private sector. The steps to achieve that goal are what the President and Bill Riley and I have called the new environmentalism. First, a strong federal government as a role model and exerting leadership in basic areas of science, setting national goals, enforcement, and related areas. Secondly, working explicitly and aggressively to integrate environmental policy into every aspect of government policymaking. And third, to focus much more than ever before on the two central institutions in our society, that is, individual people and the marketplace, and harnessing those efforts, which is what Project 88 gave us a lot of good ideas to do, in service of sustainable development in the environment. These are not easy concepts. They take a lot of work. We were talking about cultural change in institutions all around government. But an informed public, informed consumers, and a marketplace properly informed by the real cost, environmental and resource costs of actions, is the way toward sustainable development. President Bush pursued all of these goals, and consistently through a very tough economic period. Although I was glad to see today that we've had our 6th straight quarter of positive GNP growth, he kept strong forward progress throughout a time when there was a lot of concern. And the reason I think Governor Clinton hasn't talked much about the environment, in addition to sort of a schizophrenia in that camp about exactly what their policies are going to be, is that their issue is jobs. And I think they're at least implicitly saying that there is a choice that has to be made. But the record that he's pursued and that he's led is nothing short of historic. First, he did pick Bill Riley, and he has never regretted the choice. And when push came to shove, he has supported Bill Riley in many important areas. And Bill Riley believes and has said many times, despite what we hear from the other side, that he's never enjoyed as productive a period in his entire career as a conservationist as he has in advancing the ball on the environment. I won't go through a laundry list, but I think it's important to know what the facts are. The President personally supported the Clean Air Act, which is proposing to cut and will cut over 57 billion pounds of existing air pollution from the air in the next 10 years. Congress was debating and wrangling over that for 10 years. We've written rules that will account for 80% of those reductions already. Either proposed or final rules have been written, which will reduce over 45 billion pounds of air pollution already. We're fully phasing out all CFC use and production by 1995. We share the governor's concern about oceans, but not about the record. We've ended all ocean dumping of sludge, including off this beautiful coast here. The President supported a 10-year moratorium on offshore development in sensitive areas. In our basic programs, in enforcement, we have brought more civil and criminal actions, put more people in jail, and collected more fines and penalties in the last 3.5 years than the EPA did in its entire previous 19 years under 4 presidents. We never hear about that from any institution or organization. Enforcement has always been a bellwether of commitment to the environment, especially in a tough economy. In Superfund, in the last 2.5 years, we've cleaned up twice as many Superfund sites as we did in the entire previous 8 or 9 years. We're now cleaning up Superfund sites at a rate of 1 a week. This in the face of Congress every year cutting the President's request for a Superfund by $100 million. The EPA budget is up 50%, but Congress has never given us what the President asked for EPA's operating budget. In the wetlands area, did you know that the President has tried to triple the federal budget to over $800 million for study, preservation, regulation, and acquisition of wetlands, of sensitive wetlands around the country? In asking for over $200 million for the Wetland Reserve Program under the Farm Bill of 1990, Congress zero funded the President's request for wetlands. The reason I raise these issues is that in a tight budget and economic climate, the priority choices that people make in the budget tells a lot about their sense of commitment. The President has asked for more from Congress on the environment than Congress has given him, and there are a lot of other examples of that. In the face of all this, the President has still doubled the number of marine sanctuaries in our country in the last 3.5 years. He's doubled the funding for new national parks and forests. He's tripled the number of national estuaries, including 3 or 4 here, and built models for the world in the Great Lakes, the Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay, and other geographic ecosystems. The Department of Energy budget has increased 66% for research and development of conservation and renewable energy. There are many other examples, including 24 international agreements, including Agenda 21 at Rio, which was considered to be quite a success, and a great portion of which was drafted by U.S. officials, particularly EPA officials. A climate convention which will be successful in developing national action plans, and we can get into that. We've shared billions of dollars in research, and the President has been a leader in linking trade and the environment in the North American Free Trade Agreement. International trade will never be the same after the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the trilateral commission that we've created between the United States, Mexico, and Canada on environmental protection. The President also has supported doubling international assistance for preserving forests. This word doesn't get around very much. There are a lot more accomplishments. I won't go into them, but I'm happy to talk to you about any concerns you have about the basic nuts and bolts of what the President has supported over the last 3.5 years. But the last thing I want to mention that I think is so important is the legacy is greater than any list of achievements or one achievement. The legacy is the following. First, permanently for the first time making the environment part of every part of federal policy making. We all know the government's very balkanized, but if you look at the Farm Bill of 1990, the National Energy Act, the Surface Transportation Act that was just passed a few months ago, the Clean Air Act amendments, we are now integrating the environment into our transportation policy, our energy policy, and so forth. The biggest growth area in the Department of Energy budget is their environmental budget. Those are facts. As Yogi Berra says, you can look them up. Second, integrating the environment into the science and research and development policy in the government. The swords to plowshares phenomenon that you're reading about, converting over 700 national laboratories into productive civilian research, including environmental research. Governor Clinton has talked about this. It's happening, and we're glad that he supports it. And finally, achieving goals through an informed and improved marketplace, this idea of empowering the marketplace, informing consumers through Federal Trade Commission regulations about environmental claims and advertising, our Green Lights program, which is already leading to the retrofitting of energy-efficient lighting in office space equaling about 7 Los Angeleses, voluntary toxic reduction programs, designed for the environment, a new way of looking at manufacturing in this country. These are all happening. A lot of these were inspired by Project 88, but the market-based approach and acid rain and so forth are innovations. The whole policy framework really has been changed forever. What are we going to do in the future? Continue to build on this, hopefully with more support from Congress, develop a national discussion of environmental goals and priorities, mobilizing more federal labs and all agency policies to promote sustainable development, institutionalize environmental accounting and life cycle development. Have we done it all right? No, but I think that record is so historic and so substantial it deserves to be the starting point for a debate about who will be the environmental president. We've heard Governor Clinton talk on Earth Day of this year about how he had to acknowledge that Arkansas was in tough shape and he had to give the environment a back seat while he was worrying about development in the state. Now the Sierra Club endorses him. What is his agenda? He used to think that there was a dichotomy between the environment and economics. Well, the environment will always be a core value and aspiration of society. I'm interested in hearing more and talking more about our hopes and dreams and how we've pursued the goals that Bill Riley and the President have set. I also look forward to hearing from all of you. I think together, the intellectual leaders in the country and the political leaders can really build a future for our society that is both sustainable and prosperous. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much for your remarks. This evening, we have asked 3 Kennedy School students, seated over here in our version, I guess, of the journalist panel, to address questions to both of our speakers this evening. And let me introduce each of them and then turn the floor over to them. Lori Saroff is currently a first-year student in our Master's in Public Policy program, working toward a degree that will emphasize environment and energy policy. She's a graduate of Bryn Mawr College with a Bachelor of Arts in Growth and the Structure of Cities. Prior to coming to the Kennedy School for 2 years, she served with the Department of Energy, first working in their San Francisco office, and then in the D.C. headquarters of the Department of Energy, where she worked on intergovernmental affairs and helped develop strategies for implementation of the National Energy Strategy. Sally Yozel is a student in our mid-career in Masters in Public Administration program. Sally comes to us from having served for a number of years as Deputy Legislative Director for Senator John Kerry. She served as Principal Policy Advisor to Senator Kerry on all domestic and international issues concerning the environment, marine resources, and energy, stressing areas of expertise of air and water pollution, ocean and coastal protection, offshore oil and gas drilling, and related matters. Our third student panelist is Wyman Briggs. Wyman is a second-year student in the Masters in Public Policy program, also concentrating in energy and natural resource policy. Wyman has served for 6 years as an officer in the United States Coast Guard. And before coming to the Kennedy School, Wyman was in charge of coordinating oil spill response operations and developing and implementing pollution prevention policies along the coasts of Oregon and Washington. As you can see, we have some unusually well-qualified students who I think will welcome the chance to address questions to you. And if I could ask you both to go to the podiums, I think their questions will mostly be intended to elicit responses from both of you. I see that Wyman has stepped up first.
Welcome the opportunity, and welcome both of you. Both Governor Clinton and President Bush have endorsed the use of market incentives to encourage environmental protection by rewarding conservation and penalizing inefficiency. Given that the United States uses more energy per capita and per unit of GNP than any other industrialized nation, to what extent do each of the candidates propose to use market-based incentives, such as a revenue-neutral gas tax, to discourage inefficient energy users and promote conservation and less environmentally damaging energy sources?
Henry, that one's for you.
All right, well, I'll start. The effort to focus on energy as energy efficiency as well as resource use efficiency, I think there is a complementarity among efficient use of resources, including reducing the generation of waste, which it translates into hazardous waste and solid waste and so forth. And what we're focusing on is both through the energy bill, which is going to set efficiency standards, also investments in dramatically increased investments in research and development. We're going to build on the great success we've had with several programs at EPA. We've had the Green Lights program, which I mentioned, which is enormously successful. Over 700 institutions, including states like the state of Massachusetts, have signed up to retrofit their buildings with energy-efficient lighting only where they can get a positive rate of return, and that's leading to dramatic improvements. The Energy Star computer program, we're in the process of working with the industry to reduce the use of energy by computer workstations by 70% in the next few years. Intel has just developed a chip which will accomplish that. And then move toward what you could call a bubble approach, allowing industries through programs like this to develop integrated strategies, beginning to look at emissions from their facilities, including CO2 emissions, and finding ways to optimize reductions in those and optimize use of energy. In the area of a tax, The time for a gasoline tax may come someday. We don't think it's come, either in the sense of that's the right thing to do now, or in the sense of the way the public responded when a gas tax was proposed about 2 years ago. It's something that should be constantly reevaluated as we look at the whole revenue scheme and find ways to bring other taxes down. But right now, we don't think it makes sense. These other ideas are very productive and can be much more productive.
I think that there are 3 or 4 approaches to getting the incentives onto a level playing field, some of which have been tried, most of which, in all candor, have yet to be addressed by any of the campaigns. I agree with Henry that the energy bill that has passed has done taken some modest steps toward efficiency through regulation. The thing that it doesn't do, and that I think is most objectionable, is that bill continues massive subsidies for production of nuclear, coal, and oil. And in fact, those subsidies ought to be stripped out, cold turkey. If you read Bill Clinton's statements, you will see an announced desire to lower those subsidies and to look carefully at the incentives that may be necessary both for efficiency and alternate energy sources. Recycling is an important area where the incentive structure is a mess right now. Let me give you one example. This what I would call urban mining. One way to really get recycling going is to encourage the recovery of precious metals from electronic plating sludges and urban wastewater. The reason that's not happening very fast is because we subsidize the production of virgin ores by allowing mining companies the free use of federal lands. The Congress has proposed to change that and to say that people ought to be paid a reasonable royalty when people mine precious metals. The President has refused to support that. Governor Clinton does. RCRA needs to be rewritten, and I think Henry would agree with me, to put more incentives into recycling and in subchapter C to reduce some of the regulatory burden and uncertainties that inhibit recycling on that front. I would end by saying candidly, the real use of incentives in the tax system has not been addressed by any of the candidates, with the possible exception of Mr. Perot and the gas tax. And I predict to you that no matter who is elected president, we're going to have to move dramatically toward the taxation of energy, both in the name of efficiency and to gather up the externalities that are caused by the burning of fossil fuels.
Thank you. Lori Saroff.
After the Rio summit, how do you perceive the United States' role as an environmental leader, and how would this role change over the next 4 years under your respective administrations?
I'd be happy to take that one first because I can answer one of Henry's questions as well. Governor Clinton has said unequivocally that he will pick up the Rio agenda first by actively pushing a climate agreement which would allow us by the year 2000 to reduce the output of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to 1990 levels. It's an extremely modest goal. This administration watered down that treaty to the point that all it is a goal. Governor Clinton has said quite clearly that's an attainable goal, and we should commit to strengthen that language and give it the force of treaty with appropriate sanctions. Governor Clinton says, I believe correctly, we can increase employment in the course of doing that. The President says it'll cost jobs. Governor Clinton's position is that thoughtful steps to energy efficiency create jobs in 2 or 3 ways. First of all, they lower the costs of products that energy goes into, makes them more competitive. Second, it reduces the amount of investment that goes into the infrastructure to create energy and is thereby diverted from other possible investment sources. And third, obviously, a healthy environment creates a healthy workforce. Governor Clinton has also indicated unequivocally that he intends to sign the Biodiversity Treaty. He has reserved the right to make some changes if that's necessary, but unlike President Bush, he has said the United States of America ought to join all of the other nations of the industrial world in signing that treaty.
Okay, well, the targets and timetables issue, we spent a lot of time focusing on the climate treaty first. One of the problems with the climate treaty that was being proposed by a couple of countries was that it was a CO2 only treaty, and clearly CO2 is important, but in order for us, the greenhouse effect doesn't distinguish among the gases that force the greenhouse effect. Methane is much more potent than CO2. So the first thing we wanted to do was to be sure we had an agreement that focused on the range of greenhouse gases and not picked out a gas that was more advantageous to another government than our own. We wanted also to develop a regime in which every country in the world could participate. The industrialized countries had more to bring to the table and should bring more to the table. But you needed to bring the whole world along because of what's happening in the rest of the world. And a country action plan approach, which is what the President supported and we signed, is like the Montreal Protocol approach, which is so successful for CFCs, only it's more aggressive. We're contributing $25 million to developing country studies. We're developing an action plan that will be out for review by international observers early next year. And we are going to make a lot more progress than other countries, and we'll bring the world along with it in a comprehensive kind of approach. Biodiversity, the President pledged to do more substantively on biodiversity than was proposed in the treaty, and that we would make sure that the problems with the treaty that were fixed, that were delayed both because of, that were made impossible at Rio, both because of last-minute pressure from other negotiators, as well as from an idiotic memo that was leaked from our administration, and we'd be the first to admit that, was one opportunity that might have been salvaged, although the treaty had to be changed because while other countries have biotechnology, Governor Babbitt, every other country would benefit unnecessarily in terms of intellectual property transfer from the way that treaty was written. Beyond that, as I mentioned, we wrote much of Agenda 21. We've been pushing, and I think over the next few years what you're going to see is not only the integration of environment into trade policy, which President Bush has led, but the democratization of environmental policy around the world, which is the fundamental underpinning to sustainable development. That is disclosure, public information, public participation, in which we've championed and led the world, and which I think, among many other areas in which we have been leaders and intend to be leaders, we get 6,000 calls, more than 6,000 formal requests from foreign governments a year to provide technical assistance, and we answer most of them, I think. But this democratization, I think, is something that we will continue to lead on around the world.
Thank you. Sally Giselle.
Thank you both for being here. My first question on wetlands. In 1988, George Bush made clear his view on wetlands, that he supported no net loss of wetlands. And in last year, the Bush administration proposed sweeping changes to the current manual, but instead of endorsing the no net loss policy, the proposed revisions would in fact exclude from federal protection an estimated 50% of America's remaining wetlands, totaling roughly 50 million acres. To date, no wetlands policy has been enacted, and it is my understanding that this issue has been elevated beyond the Environmental Protection Agency to the Domestic Policy Council and the Council on Competitiveness within the White House. Considering the President began in 1988 with a straightforward approach, I have two questions. One, what are your candidates' view on the no net loss policy? And second, is the Domestic Policy Council or the Council on Competitiveness the correct place for this and other critical environmental issues to be addressed?
Your turn to go first.
I'll start with that one. I have been involved in wetlands policy since the early 80s, before most people were even aware of what wetlands were and how important they are. And we've come a long way in understanding much better how vitally important wetlands are and how much we've lost over the last 150 years. The President, when he campaigned in '88, was campaigning based on the manual in place then was the so-called 1987 manual. An important fact is that that was only written and followed by the Corps of Engineers. Then we went through a process, and you have to be reminded that I think over 300 members of Congress in the early part of the administration not only wanted to gut the wetlands protection programs, but they wanted to take EPA out of the wetland protection business. This was after Bill Riley vetoed the Two Forks Dam project, and the President supported that, despite a lot of concerns expressed about that kind of a move. So we've done a lot of things in the area of wetlands to support a sustainable approach to wetlands. There was a review. One thing that you have to recall as the public comes to grips with the wetlands issue is that 75% of existing wetlands reside on private property right now. And you have the most direct clash between basic private property interests of farmers and individual landowners and government programs. And I can tell you, having been involved in this program for a long time, it's very deeply felt, and that's why 300 members of Congress wanted to take EPA out of the business. The President didn't support that. He came out with a package of proposals late last year, most of which weren't noticed. More research. I mentioned Congress didn't fund about $200 million that he asked for more acquisition and research and in mitigation to have no net loss. There was the 1991 manual that you referred to. The 1991 manual, I think it's safe to say, has not been, will not be the basis on which wetlands policy is made. All the agencies have been following the 1987 manual with great success, very little complaint, and a lot of effectiveness in protecting wetlands. That's the direction we'll go. But we need to develop a policy that takes into account that you have to have total public support to protect wetlands, because 75% is privately owned, and I think we're making progress on that front.
Well, needless to say, I have a slightly different view. What the wetlands debacle is really about is, number one, Bill Riley, in the main, supported the methodology and the results of the '87 manual with some modifications. Bill Riley was flat out overruled by Vice President Quayle and an extra-legal, if not illegal, organization called the Council on Competitiveness. Which is very simply a vehicle by which the Vice President and his extremist friends gather as sort of a substitute for the legal process of agency rulemaking. Bill Riley was humiliated in that process, and it's a matter of public record. He attempted to defend the basis of the '87 manual, fought with the Vice President, and was basically told to shut up and get out by a group of people with no legal mandate who said, we're going to gut this policy. Now, what does that say about George Bush? We know Dan Quayle. We know who he is. As an environmentalist, I'll return the compliment, I'd gladly support Bill Riley for president on the environmental front. But the issue is George Bush, and where was he? He was nowhere to be seen as our wetlands policy was destroyed. Now, what would Governor Clinton do? Well, I can tell you, number one, he'd abolish the Council on Competitiveness the day he took office. And I can tell you that the '91 manual would be thrown out the window, and I can tell you that he would go back to the basis of the '87 manual, and I would hazard a guess, probably call in the National Academy of Science and say, this is a controversial issue. We've had some scientific advance since 1987, and we'd be quite happy to have some good science updating. But the bottom line is, what would Governor Clinton do? He'd get rid of your enemies on this issue.
I'll allow one exchange here.
No, I want to keep this on as high a plane as possible, but I do have to mention one interesting vignette. Bill Riley and I were given a copy of a big newspaper headline that says, White House to EPA, shut up or quit. And we thought, oh boy, what's going on? And as it turned out, it was a headline from the Carter administration. It was Jody Powell who was being quoted at the time, and the Carter administration had a review group. I'll be interested. I think that every president has wanted some kind of a review process. The question is, what's the bottom line? What ultimately emerges from these processes? And as I said, the 87 manual is what's being enforced right now.
Wyman?
Over the past decade, tens of billions of dollars have been spent on EPA's Superfund program. Yet, only a small fraction of the 22,000 Superfund sites that have been identified have been cleaned up. Currently, almost one-half of all Superfund appropriations go to pay lawyers' fees. What are the candidates' plans to reform the Superfund program and ensure that taxpayers' money goes toward removal of toxic waste instead of paying lawyers' fees?
You may have noticed that both of our speakers are practicing attorneys at various times in their careers. Governor Babbitt?
Well, I suspect this is an area where both Henry and I are going to be in substantial agreement. There is no question that the Superfund process is not working. It's not working because of the liability provisions. It is not working because there has not been adequate attention to this issue of triage, setting priorities, and, frankly, the zero contamination goal, or the equivalent as expressed in current law, is in many cases unrealistic. And what that means is a big rewrite of the Superfund law. I don't fault Bill Riley for his efforts here. I think he has made a manful effort. He entered EPA having had the experience of a program called Clean Sites that he had worked on. He entered EPA with enormous knowledge and sophistication about these issues. He's tried. Now, just to show my sort of nonpartisan spirit here, I will tell you that the President and the Congress are equally to blame for the gridlock over Superfund.
You're here. I guess I would only add to that by saying, you recall I mentioned in my opening comments developing a coherent thread of principles to govern the way society comes to grips with the environment for the long run. And one of those principles is focusing with the scientific community on a sense of priorities, what we need as a society to address as a priority matter. And many scientists and experts are coming in saying cleaning up toxic sites to these levels, spending hundreds of billions of dollars, is not necessarily the best use of society's resources and in terms of risk reduction. And so it is important that we continue to engage and that we have continuity in this process of as a society, identifying priorities and focusing on those priorities. And Superfund is a problematic program, but I do think that we have made it more efficient, gotten a lot more bang for the buck, minimized some of these litigation costs, about as much as anybody can do, I think.
Lori?
With the energy bill that was recently passed, as we noted earlier, there were no automobile efficiency standards. And, how can we have an energy strategy that does not take into account one of the largest energy sectors in this country? And in regards with that, what are both of the administration's viewpoints on how to increase efficiency within the transportation sector?
Havoc, I think you're first.
My turn? Okay. The important thing about fuel efficiency standards, there are a number of analyses with regard to safety and economics about those standards. I think the important fact here is the approach. That I think we all have a goal. We recognize that cars are an enormous contributor both to energy use and to pollution. And the question is, what's the best strategy to fundamentally change the way we get around in society, but in a way that's consistent with the aspirations and desires of citizens? We know citizens love their cars and the mobility that comes from that, and we have to take that into account in a democratic society. But the question is, should we mandate increasingly expensive increases in mandated, federally command and controlled fuel efficiency, or should we develop a strategy that has the government pushing the envelope, but industry looking at alternative fuels, at electric cars, compressed natural gas cars, breakthroughs in technology that will be a better use of those resources, like Superfund? Do we want to be forcing the expenditure of resources on increasing fuel economy with a number of potential consequences, or really have a visionary strategy that says, let's invest in electric cars, which we've done, let's invest in compressed natural gas vehicles, let's look at providing other kinds of incentives for fuel efficiency? And that's what it's all about. And I'll be interested in Governor Clinton's position after the last couple of debates. I'm not sure where he is on 45 miles a gallon right now.
Okay, here it is. First of all, let's acknowledge what this issue is about. We must find more efficient means of traveling. Now, with respect to the automobile, there are really two ways to do that. One is to use the economic incentives that are inherent in the tax system. There are a number of really interesting proposals. The gas tax is one. A second one is a gas tax keyed to the amount of pollutants in the fuel. A third one put forth by Amory Lovins is known as fee-bates. It's a revenue-neutral system in which gas guzzlers would have a big tax which would be rebated to fuel-efficient car purchasers. A neat means of paying for the externalities and making the people who pollute pay. Now, the fact is that in this campaign, those issues are not on the table. Now, the irony, of course, is that the people who preach most about market incentives are least eager to talk about it. If you're not going to use economic incentives, you must use regulatory sticks. Now, the reason the CAFE standards has become such an issue in the minds of many is this. It's been a tremendous success. Some years back, the United States government mandated to Detroit that the fuel average be bumped up from 14 to approximately 26 miles per gallon. That means every day, as a result of that government mandate, we are saving as much oil as is imported from the entire Persian Gulf, thereby lowering our trade deficit, cleaning up the environment, and no one in Detroit with a straight face would say that that's cost American jobs. What it has created is a great deal of American technology, which is now being deployed under patents and other forms of property protection into the rest of the world. Bear in mind, again, Germans, Japanese, everybody else complies with those standards. Now, this administration, for reasons that I don't understand, has basically said, we can't possibly talk specifically about going above 26. Governor Clinton has said, I accept the goal of moving that up to 45 miles per gallon by the end of this century. He has not specified how much in which year, but he has committed to that goal. Now, just once again, to finish by emphasizing the importance of this, if we did that, we could again eliminate all oil imports from the Persian Gulf. If you would up the mileage average by 2 miles per gallon, we would save more oil every single day than the president could get by throwing open the Arctic Wildlife Refuge and striking oil. And again, it illustrates the lack of will, the addiction to imported oil, and the unwillingness to do what's in the manifest economic interest of this country.
Sally?
Can I just ask, so the governor does support a mandated 45 mile per gallon by the year 2000?
Oh, which governor? This one?
Governor Clinton.
Oh, Governor Clinton. Governor. I do, yes. Governor Clinton said, and I quote him, in the last television debate, I support the goal of 45 miles per gallon by the end of the century. Now, I suppose you can quibble whether or not that constitutes a written legislative proposal or what. But all I can say is, what have we heard from George Bush?
That he doesn't support it.
Right on.
Continuing on the energy discussion, the new energy bill streamlines the licensing of nuclear power plants with its one-step licensing plan. What are your thoughts on strategies beginning to build nuclear power plants again in America when we have yet to solve the issue of nuclear waste disposal? And what are your candidates' plans on nuclear waste disposal in the future?
Governor, I think you're first this time.
Okay. Any utility company seriously proposing to build a nuclear power plant anytime in the near future, I think would be sued for malfeasance by its shareholders. It's absurd. We have a current surplus of energy in most parts of this country. The utilities that have gone nuclear have suffered dearly. It is, without any question, the most expensive form of energy you can possibly put on the drawing boards at this time. We've had all of this debate with the nuclear guys hollering and screaming about single-step licensing and all of this. Since 1974 in the United States, not a single utility has applied for a single nuclear license. You'd have to be crazy in economic terms to do it. Now, is there a future for nuclear? Not in the near term. The simple efficiency steps that have been outlined by hundreds of people, including a lot of people at this university, make it crystal clear that we could up our energy efficiency by an easy 30%. Photovoltaics, once out of sight, are now down to approximately 35 to 40 cents per kilowatt hour, moving toward the magic 6%. There are other kinds of energy coming on. Look at the windmills out at Altamont. Are any of them panaceas? No. Are there a lot of alternatives? Yes. Natural gas, clearly moving. I agree with Henry. One thing that an oil president could have done was mandate a strong and fast conversion to compressed natural gas. You've got all of these alternatives. So what about nuclear? Well, the day may come when we'll have to say we have failed at all other things and have a second look at it. It's not going to be in my lifetime. It's just not in the cards. Obviously, the carbon dioxide threat, the global warming threat, says quite clearly that by sometime in the next century, we're going to have to scale down fossil fuels dramatically, probably cut them at least in half. Now, the question that I can't answer for Governor Clinton, and nobody can answer, is what happens at that point in 2025? Well, I'll tell you where my bets are, and I'll tell you where Governor Clinton's bets are. They're on a whole variety of alternative energy sources and not on nuclear.
I agree that we're going to see, I think, fundamental and sometimes unpredictable changes in the energy mix over the next 40 to 50 years. And the President has supported building a climate in which that can happen, where the government doesn't mandate any particular outcome, but provides the wherewithal and removes barriers to a range of possibilities. Nuclear is one of those. I share Governor Babbitt's general pessimism based on the experience of the last 20 years about the likelihood that people are going to start investing heavily in nuclear power plants in the United States soon. But we also know that technology, having gone to a small country school south of here, Princeton, I'm aware of the kind of work that's going on in nuclear-related energy, in safer development and potentially safe disposal. At the end of the day, I mentioned at the beginning, the key institutions in our society are the people and the marketplace. There are other key institutions, but two key institutions we need to focus on in the environmental policy area more are the people and the marketplace. Nobody's going to force nuclear power down the people's throats. They have to be convinced that the technology's gotten to the point that it's cleaner, it's competitive, and it's safe enough. We may or may not get there, but we want to be sure that there are no unnecessary barriers to that alternative being allowed to prove itself.
Thank you. At this time, we'll ask our questioners to hold off for a few minutes, and if we have time, we'll come back for some additional questions. But we have an audience of students and faculty and interested citizens who I think many of whom would like to address questions. So at this time, if you have a question that you'd like to address to our speakers, you can begin lining up behind the microphones. I'll go from one side to the other, and we'll take as many as we can, time permitting. We'll start on this side and then this side.
Hello, my name is Yusuf Hashimi, a proud citizen of the most beautiful state in the country, Arizona. In listening to both the answers to the previous question brings up something that I'm particularly concerned about and interested in. Harry Braun, who's a resident of Arizona, has written a book called The Phoenix Project, which talks about a transition to renewable energy resources, in particular solar hydrogen economy. And what I'd like to ask Mr. Havoc is, how come the research and development funding for research for hydrogen and solar hydrogen has been drastically cut, and what are you going to do to change that in future administrations? It started in the Reagan administration, the cuts, and to Governor Babbitt, if the Clinton administration is going to increase funding for research and development in solar hydrogen. And I think that might answer both of your questions about what will replace fossil fuels is possibly hydrogen fuel, but that nobody knows about it and that funding was cut for it, and what is going to be done.
Mm-hmm. The possibilities in hydrogen, solar, and a lot of other areas are very exciting. And funding has increased over the last couple of years for research in those and related renewable and conservation research areas, and they'll increase further under the new energy bill. So I think that's going to move forward. I think one of the exciting developments that we have been pioneering over the last year is the use of the Federal Technology Transfer Act. I mean, one of the big challenges in government, we have over 700 labs in the government, and we'll be the first to admit they talk to each other more than they used to. The scientists talk to each other more than they used to, but they still don't coordinate very well. And we can get a lot more out of our resources, first by coordinating, but there's always the challenge of how do you set priorities for scientists in basic research? Do you pick one technology and throw everything into that, or do you spread it in a reasonable way based on some sense of potential? What we've done is to begin to develop cooperative research and development agreements under this new Federal Technology Transfer Act. We've gone from virtually 0 3 years ago to I think about 200 now, where the government puts in money and research expertise and the private sector does. This is going to be a way of helping us to focus on, and there's certainly a lot in the solar area, and I think hydrogen does have a lot of exciting potential. So that's an area where we reorient our labs, which we're doing in a dramatic way, develop some of these partnerships with private sector scientists, and continue the process of moving toward a broad range, but always remembering that the federal government, nobody's smart enough in the federal government to sit there and say, this is the one that the world is going to buy 40 years from now. We have to create the climate and then let the great minds in the private and public sector make it happen.
The great paradox with solar is that government support was phased out at the very time that it was really moving up toward the goal line. The Rocky Mountain Institute, run by Amory Lovins, has put out a publication demonstrating that federal support for nuclear and fossil fuels in the form of tax credits and subsidies is $50 billion a year. Now, alongside that, the support in the form of tax credits, support for research and development, and government purchasing policies for alternative forms of energy has simply faded away. And as a consequence of that, ironically, the lead has passed to the Germans and the Japanese. I was in Ventura, California last week and went to the local Siemens plant, owned by the Germans. They're putting out solar panels at slightly under 40 cents a kilowatt hour now. They're really getting close. On the way out, I was handed a sheet which said, if you believe in this, you could have a consistent tax investment credit policy. We don't have one. If you really believe in this, someone might encourage the federal government to make a few purchases along the way. And in terms of Governor Clinton's policies, I can tell you that that $50 billion is going to get a hard look. And if we could transfer even 10% of that, we could accelerate this revolution.
First, I'd like to say I still don't know why you didn't get the Democratic nomination in '88. That's Governor Babbitt. Today I saw a bumper sticker. It said Hillary's husband. And I wonder if your bumper sticker says Gore's running mate. And for those of us who are really unenlightened about Clinton's record on the environment in Arkansas, I wondered if you could tell us about it.
Sure. Let me address the Clinton and Bush records with just a very short flashback to the year 1991. The board of the League of Conservation Voters met in 1991 up in West Virginia and decided that on the basis of the evidence then available that we would not take a position in the presidential race. This was before President Bush had gone crazy against the environment. It was at a time in New Hampshire when the Democratic candidates weren't saying much at all, and it didn't appear that there was a large choice. What happened to change our collective mind was the events of the past year. As the president decides that he's going to win this election by saying it's jobs or the environment, and the environment is the enemy, Bill Clinton emerged and made a speech on Earth Day last April, in which, as Henry has very quickly and I think accurately said, Bill Clinton acknowledged that during much of his tenure as governor of Arkansas, he too was tended to be swayed by this false dichotomy of you have to make a choice either or. But the fact is that as Bush has gone this way, Clinton has gone this way. In his last couple of years as governor of Arkansas, he sponsored some very strong and progressive legislation. It's on the record, much better than in his earlier years. He laid out a program on Earth Day in which he took a position on the Global Warming Treaty, on the Biodiversity Treaty, on wetlands, on ANWR, on population. Did you know that President Bush vetoed the entire foreign aid bill this last year because it had $15 million earmarked for the United Nations Population Fund? Well, Bill Clinton feels differently about that, believe me. He then underscored this by selecting Al Gore and putting him on the ticket. And so the answer is we see a lot of growth in one candidate and an enormously strong platform, and just the opposite in the other, a lot of regression, sort of headed toward the bottom.
If I can just briefly respond, it sounds it's mostly a trust me approach. I've seen the light. The important point, I think, and I won't get into a lot of gory detail other than to say that I wish I could say I plan to say that. In any event, the environmental community and many organizations, nonpartisan, ranked Arkansas right at the bottom of the list. Governor Clinton acknowledged that he had tough decisions and the environment took a back seat. Maybe he's seen the light, I don't know, but I think the important distinction is that President Bush, and I must say I appreciate Governor Babbitt is sincere when he says he thinks that we're in some kind of decline, but I know my family has seen no less of me. I know more of me in the last year than they had in the prior years, and it's all because we're continuing to produce dramatic results in the environment. So the President has had hands-on building the environment into every aspect of government policy over the last 4 years. He's been in the private sector in many different institutions. Governor Clinton, only reference point, really, in his career is governor of Arkansas. We saw what he did there. His only reference point is government. Government is very important, but it's also important to have an environmental policy that doesn't simply look to government for all the answers. You can't regulate or mandate every problem out of existence. George Bush has grappled with those with hands-on, with enormously positive results. Governor Clinton may have seen the light, he may not have. Sometimes he embraces Al Gore, sometimes he seems to back away. We just don't know. We do know what happened in Arkansas, and I think the record is very strong over the last 4 years in this administration.
Let the record show Governor Clinton does not support strip mining in national parks.
And the Bush administration doesn't either. That is one of the great red herrings in political history. That was simply an effort to acknowledge that you had people who had private enforceable property rights, and to try to deal with it, not by encouraging them to strip mine, but simply by coming to grips with that issue. It's not, that's about as much as I know, because that's not our program, but I do know, having been at the Justice Department, that that's the issue, is how do you deal with people who have private property rights in national parks, and the objective was not to permit strip mining, but simply to come to grips with that.
Oh.
This is another question on economic incentives. It's been a few years since Brazil got out of the business of subsidizing cattle ranching in the Amazon. My question is, under the respective administrations, when would we get out of the business of subsidizing grazing, mining, and logging on public land in the West?
Am I first on that one, or are you?
I think you are first, actually.
I think that a true market-oriented approach has to look at subsidies. You have to look at is there a free market in certain kinds of resources, and phasing out subsidies is an important objective in the area of timber harvesting, below-cost timber sales. Those are being phased out. In the water area, subsidized water projects are being phased out. You have a lot of activity that's been relying on that, but moving in that direction is something that the administration supports, and we need to support around the world as we harmonize trade policy and look for what actions governments take that are unfair trade practices, and what actions government takes that are legitimate environmental protection measures. And we're certainly seeing that as a growing issue around the world.
Governor Clinton made, I think, quite clear in his answer to our questionnaire that he strongly supported the end of subsidies in the natural resource sector. This administration has taken a couple of sort of halting steps. The most egregious one, of course, is the subsidized timber cutting, which is turning the national forests of the West into sort of southern-style plantations full of young trees, the old growth simply disappearing before a subsidized onslaught in which round logs from the Tongass National Forest were going to Japan for the price of a McDonald's hamburger, when you factor in which road construction by the United States Forest Service was being amortized over 300 years in order to hide the subsidies. The President took a stab at it in his 1989 budget, lost, and went home, and has never been heard from again. But it's a serious issue. It applies to grazing, water, mining. The President has been hiding on mining reform. Even in Arizona, the last stronghold of the rugged individualist having and claiming absolute title to anything that can be found on the land. Even in Arizona, the state government charges royalties for mining on public land. The United States government does not, and the administration hid during that battle in Congress this year.
Sometimes during Superfund cleanups, it's necessary to destroy ecosystems, and I was wondering what your respective candidates feel about the proper way to balance the risk to humans and the risk to the environment.
You're first this time.
Well, obviously, they're both very important. Now, applied to Superfund, I would say this. The most pervasive and difficult Superfund issue is the contamination of groundwater and the migration of that groundwater off-site to appear contaminating surface water flows. That has to be dealt with. I think that in terms of of setting priorities, where there is not a strong hydrologic connection that brings it back up, it has less priority. The first driving issue is, of course, drinking water. Is wildlife important? Yes. Look at the Kesterson Refuge in California. It's not a Superfund site, to my knowledge, but it is every bit the equivalent of a Superfund site, and there's a point at which you say, we can't tolerate that. Now, is there a direct trade-off between protecting wildlife and protecting humans? This administration would want to say yes. They would say, well, that's the equivalent of jobs versus owls. The fact is that there are very few of those trade-offs, except where government officials want to make a political point. I was involved in an endangered species water Superfund problem involving the entire state of Nevada and eastern California. And I watched a young senator named Harry Reid from Nevada stake his entire career on a 6-year negotiation process involving 2 states and bring an incredible problem of wildlife contamination, water contamination, Superfund site endangered species to conclusion successfully. This administration, I won't outright accuse them of bad faith, but there isn't the will to try to bring people together to resolve those people versus wildlife trade-offs. They certainly haven't done it in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, I would say quite the contrary. I think one of the things that has been a major theme of our environmental policy over the last few years is that we haven't paid enough attention to ecological values. Now, when you have direct clashes in a specific case, those issues do have to be worked out, and we've had a lot of meetings with the public in the Northwest to deal with those owl issues, and there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides. But in Superfund, your question was about the potential that a cleanup could impact an ecosystem, and maybe New Bedford Harbor is an example of that. That's a real issue, and we have, certainly when you have a direct, significant, documented cancer threat to people and a threat to wildlife, people are generally, I think, going to prevail. But a lot of the threats that we deal with are remote and attenuated, and we would very much say that in many cases we need to be more concerned with the ecology. And if there's a the problem with Superfund sites, as you know, so many of them, because of where industrial activity was located, are located in wetlands, for example, and in coastal areas. So we need to clean those up. But if there is a greater threat from the cleanup, it would be nice if the law gave us the flexibility to say, no, here's a case in which protecting this ecosystem is a lot more important than a potentially fairly remote health risk. But I also agree that groundwater is a great challenge. One of the big challenges we have to put good scientific minds to working on.
I'm not sure either of us answered your question. He certainly did a better job than I did. I don't know about New Bedford.
Unfortunately, I have another question
about... If you did, I'd be overwhelmed.
I have another question about Superfund. You mentioned, Governor Babbitt, a rewrite. The Superfund is based on the polluter pays principle. That is what is blamed for causing the lawyers getting all the money. In your rewrite, what would you do with the polluter pays principle? How would you reframe that?
Well, I would preserve the polluter pays principle. It's correct, and certainly from the date of CERCLA forward, it makes an enormous amount of sense to say we've established civil and criminal liability and we're going to be uncompromising in cost allocation. The problem has arisen because of the retrospective application of that against polluters, where legal standards were often either vague or non-existent, and where there has been a tendency to use the old common law principle of finding somebody who dumped a paint can in a dump and presenting them with a bill for $20 million and saying, you go find the other guys. And it's a tough problem. I'm not saying I have an answer. And I guess the other issue is that, and it's terribly complicated, about getting cleanup plans underway and executed, even in the face of a continuing quarrel over liability. And there's obviously, I don't know if we can do anything about it or not. I would hope we could.
Just briefly, in Superfund, we've succeeded now in having about 60% of the cleanups that are going forward based on private party financial commitments. It's commitments that now are approaching $4 billion. And that's a success. I think it's important that we have maximum private party cleanup because they generally do it faster. They care about it. They get into it, and it expands our ability to clean up quickly. But I agree with Governor Babbitt that this is an issue that needs to be looked at. The interplay between retroactive, absolute, strict joint and several liability and the cleanup standards does create incentives for litigation. I think you don't have to abandon the polluter pays principle, but you need to look at that interplay.
My name is Tom Steinbach. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. My question is, should your respective candidate win next Tuesday, will he create an environment cabinet-level position? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, I'll be happy to start with that one. The President has promoted and supported cabinet status for EPA consistently throughout his administration, and something he still strongly supports. The Senate moved forward. The House first put a lot of added Christmas tree provisions onto the bill, and then when the issue came back up again in the last year, the House just refused to consider it. The time really has come. The President's done everything but create EPA as a cabinet position. He's treated Bill Riley like a cabinet member, and he has, as I said, integrated the environment into so many areas of policy. But in order for EPA to be an effective long-term factor, both in terms of influencing policy and being sensitive to other policy issues, it's critical, and I know the President strongly supports it.
I think there's been some game playing on both sides in the struggle over whether or not to have cabinet-level authorization. The President clearly does want EPA at cabinet level. In the initial volleying between the President and Congress, the Congress tacked some provisions on that bill relating to an expanded authority for EPA to gather data and sort of put itself in the position of what the Council, the CEA, Council of Economic Advisors, to provide a wide array of monitoring and baseline data. That was not acceptable to the President, but I would concede that there was some game playing in Congress, I think directed at saying, even if we could find a compromise, we're not sure we want to give you a victory in the form of a cabinet-level position. Now, the League of Conservation Voters has never put this issue on its scorecard. Our job in Washington is to score the environmental votes of all members of Congress, which enables me to go out and campaign, and we deploy money and volunteers for our friends and flail our enemies. We've never scored the cabinet level legislation because we've never thought that it was really that important. Now, I must tell you that reading the rumors in the newspapers these days, I've started to have personal second thoughts. But it still isn't very important.
I'm informed we have time for only one more question. Holly?
I'm Holly Kaufman, and I'm in the mid-career program here at the Kennedy School. In 20, 30 years ago, the environment was really the domain of sort of mad scientists and later other fringe elements of society, and it has really grown to become something very important. And my question to you is about another budding fringe movement, and that's the wise use movement. And how important do you think this is? How potent a force do you think this would become? And if you do think that the wise use movement is something that could potentially grow, how do you respond to these individuals and the ideas they're putting forward?
The wise use movement is an ominous cloud sort of gathering across the West and moving east. It originally began as an outgrowth of the Sagebrush Rebellion. It was basically a quarrel by the users of public lands saying, we want to go back to the old days when we could cut trees at will, graze the land to a dust bowl at will, They basically view the public lands as their private domain, and that's the origins of it. Now, it has expanded into a much wider base, collecting together all kinds of people with grievances against government regulation, some legitimate, some kooky, a lot in between. Off-road vehicle users, the National Rifle Association, the big mining companies, the little guys. At the root of it is an issue which is going to come to dominate the environmental discussion in the next 10 years. Henry referred to it in his discussion of wetlands, and I commend it to you for intellectual analysis. It is the emerging concept that any form of government zoning or land use regulation is a deprivation of my right to do whatever I damn please with my land, no matter how detrimental to the community at large. It is a full-scale onslaught which says, once I have cattle on public land, I have a right to keep them there and you can't reduce the number. You cannot regulate wetlands. I'm entitled to build a shopping center in a wetland unless you pay me the full value. It's the issue which came to the Supreme Court in Lucas versus South Carolina, which involved South Carolina's mandate that you couldn't build cottages on a shifting sandbar, which was there and then not there and moving all over the place. The opinion of the Supreme Court in Lucas versus South Carolina is quite moderate, but there are a couple of ominous footnotes, which of course takes us again to the issue of what kinds of justices are appointed by presidents. Do you really want the Clarence Thomas kind of process? Is that really the president? Do you really believe him when he said, I found the best justice material in the United States of America? It's worse than that. There's a place called the Court of Claims. Just very briefly, I won't get carried away. Reagan and Bush appointees on the Court of Claims have begun handing out huge condemnation awards based upon what used to be considered reasonable land use regulation. And if the Reagan-Bush judges get hold of this thing, the day may come when somebody wants to build an abattoir next to your house to slaughter cattle, and the government will be prohibited from doing anything about it unless he's paid the value of his alleged right to build a slaughterhouse.
Well, I don't for a second lose even the slightest bit of sleep that that kind of scenario will ever occur in our country. I think that it's part of the genius, and sometimes a frustrating part of the genius of our system, that policy is forged in a crucible that's heated up by extreme views at both ends of the spectrum. And I don't, it's dangerous to use labels, but certainly what I've understood to be some of the tenets of the wise use movement, I think are extreme, and deny a rational discussion of what really is involved in using private property in a way that harms resources and harms other people. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the same thing of the environment trumping everything. And people get upset about it and worked up. That's part of our system, sometimes too much. I hope that we can move in the environmental area toward a rational discussion of these issues where private property, the marketplace, individual liberty are important, as they've always been in society. But they are not used beyond what the facts justify. So I'm concerned about the wise use movement too. I'm not concerned about people raising private property issues, and I don't think that we'll ever get to the point where we should ever consider cutting back on traditional protections of private property, but simply acknowledging that environmental protection is about the commons and about the common good.
Thank you. Let me announce that immediately following this session, there will be an open reception in the Penthouse, which is at the top floor of the building that we're in right now. And if it's not too crowded, you may get some opportunity to talk to our two speakers tonight. Let me first thank our panelists this evening, Wyman Briggs, Sally Ozell and Laurie Saroff, for your thoughtful questions and participation. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. We're all becoming familiar in the televised presidential debates of these minute-by-minute or second-by-second tracking polls on how the candidates are doing. And I suppose you'll have to both look elsewhere for that kind of response, but I know that this audience would like to thank you for your commitment in being here, your commitment to public service, and your thoughtful remarks tonight. So thank you to Bruce Babbitt and to Henry Havoc. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was fun. It's been waiting to go the whole time. Right. Yeah, very well. Yeah. I didn't want to go up there. It wasn't.
Lynn to jump on the Princeton bandwagon.
I want to ask Bruce about
That's a good idea. I think I'll go up just to see whether there's anybody there. Just an all hang out if there are plenty of people.
Enjoyed it very much. You know what I